Corry, editor of Air and Travel magazine, is on the line. Eoghan, good morning.
Good morning, Pat.
What did you make of the latest round of instructions or advice?
As with the rest of the country, quite confused. It was one of the most confusing press conferences we've had. The measures that were sort of hinted at are as important as the ones that were announced. It does look like that what we're going through at the moment with a 3-county lockdown is probably being examined as to the impact that it has, as to whether that could be extended or localised further in the rest of the country. But the measure that's in place until midnight on Sunday effectively ends the prospect of home holidays out of those 3 counties and any holidays into those 3 counties. So in the terms of how that impacts on people who are planning to holiday at home, it had a huge impact. It had a very, very large impact on the 3 counties. If that was to be extended to other regions, it would be, I think everybody will be looking and measuring what the impact of that will be.
So the advice to people who may have booked a staycation is whatever you have in yourself kind of thing. I mean, they didn't say don't go. They said kind of think about it and make your own decision.
Reading between the lines, Pat, from the beginning, Enfit or Neffit, the artist formerly known as Enfit, they have been quite against movement. And that's because their agenda is purely defined by health. They don't want to move outside the boundaries of what is going to achieve that goal of the lowest possible incidence, hopefully zero. So even at a press conference about 2 weeks ago, when Ronan Glynn was talking about international travel, he also opined that he didn't want holidays within Ireland as well. The other departments within the government or within the civil service have different views. And what we've seen since the start of this crisis is that health has won all the arguments. This is the one argument where the government has stood up and said, we're against international travel, but we do want people to holiday at home. And the reason is that it doesn't need much explaining that the entire inbound tourism industry is facing an existential crisis. So I suspect the health people are happy to let a little bit of home holidaying going on, but if they are looking at outbreaks, localised incidents, and that really has been the pattern, not just in Ireland, all over Europe. You keep a grasp on this virus, it dies down. Once you loosen the grasp, it starts rising again. And they may come out with localised advice against travelling, against taking those staycation. And that means that you lose your money. Everybody loses money here. The hotels lose the bookings because the hotels in Kildare, Offaly and Laois were told no new check-ins. Anybody who came could stay. But the people who were living in Kildare, Laois and Offaly were told do not leave the county. And the people who are coming in to Kildare, Laois and Offaly were told don't enter. The hotel beds, most of those hotel beds are in Kildare. There's about 1,200 in Kildare and about 350 in Offaly and about 525 in Laois. So the biggest impact were the staycationers coming into Kildare, and Kildare would have the vast majority of the visiting in the stats of last year. Kildare would have had about 220,000 visitors, where there'd only be 50,000 each in Laois and Offaly. So Kildare bore the brunt of the lockdown. If a lockdown was to hit, for instance, anywhere...
Here's the question I have.
Yeah.
So I book into the most famous resort, I suppose, in Kildare, the K Club.
The K Club, yeah.
And you're there, and suddenly you're locked in to Kildare. I presume you can stay till the end of your booking, okay?
That's exactly how it works.
When you leave Kildare to go back to Dublin or Cork, wherever it is, do you have to isolate?
No, the 14-day isolation hasn't been introduced, but it does raise the question.
I mean? If this is a hot zone, you're in Kildare, you're surrounded by COVID, and then you leave it, you'd imagine that they'd be giving you advice about, locking yourself in. The reason I'm being silly about this is because it's all over the place.
It's silly. The silliness is extended to international travel. The 14-day quarantine has made no sense. It's made no difference to people who are actually flying out on holiday. But if there are loads of internet memes following that theme, that farcical theme that you've just raised about a 14-day quarantine and barbed wire fences around the county. I think the reaction to what happened over the last 2 weeks, because this is the first time we've had a localised lockdown in Ireland, and we're learning about this as we go along. I suspect that the lessons from the last 3-week lockdown of Kildare, Laois and Offaly will be picked up. But I was going to say, if this happened on the Wild Atlantic, the part of Ireland that is performing at the moment is the Wild Atlantic Way. The occupancy in some of the hotels can be quite high. The big resort hotels with lots of facilities like Inchydoney, places like that would have very, very high occupancy, 80-90%. Most of the hotels are seeing around Galway's doing well, Dingle's doing well, Killarney's not doing as well, Mayo is doing well, self-catering is doing well, the boat hire and the Shannon, they've had a bad couple of decades or a bad time since the recession. They've been doing well. Anywhere you can get out into the open with the wind blowing through your hair. But let's say a localised lockdown hit one of those. The season is really short. The industry is struggling to get anything back out of 2020. It would be catastrophic.
I passed through Carrick and Shannon the other day, and there's still a lot of boats tied up. Not all of them out being rented. Anecdotally from various hotels, all doing well. They've lost, of course, the early part of the summer, so they're trying to retrieve what's left of the summer. And many of them, pretty close to 100% booking. But any kind of a lockdown will kibosh the rest of their season.
And doing well is relative, as you alluded to, Pat, because the early part of the season was lost. The crisis developed in March when the booking was going on. The school going back to school is going to effectively finish the season. The real pressure then is all the guys who have to go through 2020 with no cash and just basically get their living will now have to survive till March, April. And then if international opens up again, which we're all hoping for, because the schedules are loaded. It's quite one of the interesting things that happened over the last 4 or 5 days is a lot of the schedules being loaded, and very good news for Irish tourism in that routes are being kept. For instance, some of the Shannon routes from American Airlines, for example, the Aer Lingus routes to Hartford, they're being loaded for 2021. There is a few tripwires we have to get over before we actually get into that season. But the major problem for Irish tourism is what will be left to sell, and will we have a number of failures in the inbound tourism industry, which will reduce the critical mass, because we need the mix of hotel, safe catering, activities, visitor centres. They've been very badly hit. We need the mix of all of that for our tourism industry to perform at a high level, and they have been performing at Champions League level in Europe in the last few years.
Now, we have to talk about people who have booked. Some have paid a deposit, and for one reason or another, lockdown or isolation, that terrible word cocooning, whatever it might be, they decided we're not going. Do they forfeit the deposit? Do they forfeit if they paid the full amount? Do they forfeit everything? Have hotels got a consistent policy through the Irish Hotels Federation? Do they, like Ryanair started to do for bookings after the epidemic started? They said, well, you can change your booking if circumstances change at no cost. I mean, do resorts or hotels say, if you have to cancel, we won't give you your money back, but we'll give you the voucher for the equivalent holiday at a time when you feel it's safe to book it?
Ireland and internationally, the accommodation has been better at giving money back, including deposits, than airlines. You mentioned Ryanair, July the 10th. If you book before July the 10th, you don't get your free change. If you book since July the 10th, you do. It's quite an anomaly, which is causing huge angst through the country. Back to the deposits, there's no reason to give the deposit back. Non-refundable deposits would be part of what goes on in the hotel sector. But where aviation went one way and hotels went another in the last few years is the hotels were a little bit more confident about giving full cancellation, no penalty cancellation. The reason they were doing that was they found that it increased bookings. People were more ready to give a booking to a hotel when they knew they weren't losing a deposit, and particularly in the business market, they liked it, and the hotels made more money out of the fact that they had no cancellation fee than they lost when the cancellations actually occurred. What I've noticed for 2021 is some of the hotel groups bringing back and no refund deposit. It's a very bad timing because this is when people are most nervous about travelling. It's a case-by-case basis. There isn't a industry standard on this. But I have noticed and I've found that the industry has been very, very good at working with their clients, moving dates and refunding. There's a real sense that they're in this for the long haul and they're not going to try and, which is more important, keeping your cash going is really important, but keeping your client happy and keeping your client warm for a future booking is equally important. And the industry, the accommodation industry, not just in Ireland, has been really performing well. Some of the other industries have not been performing as well. Aviation being a classic example. The airline policies are all over the place. They diverge from airline to airline. Some of the big culprits for no refunds back in March and April are some of the best guys now, and some of the guys who were quick to refund are now some of the worst. Cruise industry, a lot of promises, but not as much delivered as they have promised. But accommodation hotels in Ireland for Irish clients and internationally, they've been much, much better.
Some of the text, there was no mention of the Greenlist review yesterday. Has anything changed?
The Greenlist, I suspect, is about to perish. It hasn't, it's been not fit for purpose for any reason. It didn't actually give the clarity that we needed for instance, business trips and things like that to get going again. Never mind the holidays, which the government was set against. The second thing that happened, and Ronan Lynn said at the very beginning, that when Ireland was around 4 cases over the last rolling average of 14 days, that he didn't want the green list to increase by Ireland going up. But what we've seen since is that Ireland has been creeping up past the 20, which is the white list. The 20 was if you're a non-EU country to get into the EU, 20 was the standard. They were, but all the other countries have risen as well. If you were to do the green list today, Britain and Germany would be on it. Cyprus would be on it. Greece would be very close. Portugal, which would have been way off the first green list, would be very close. Spain, which would be close to the first green list, is way off the top. So the countries are moving. There are so many moving parts to this that the green list, as it's compiled, makes no planning possible either for an airline or for a tourism body or for business people who want their machines serviced, waiting for an engineer to come in who has to be fully insured. And I think coming to the end of this week that the green list might be binned altogether and we might be back to the original advice, which was all but essential travel banned for nearly the whole world. That's a disastrous policy. All the other European countries, while they've policies for non-EU countries, like, for instance, America with very high levels, they have kept Europe open, and when they've brought in measures like France did with Catalonia, like Norway did with parts of Sweden, like Finland did, or they've localized it to regions. We have gone our own way on this, and I think we may have been influenced by what was happening in Britain, which has a different agenda.
Got back yesterday from a couple of days, and Dingle, says Paul in Cork, the place was hopping. Looks like the dogs have discovered West Kerry. Local businesses reckon it's been a great summer despite everything that's going on. Someone else says no one wants to admit a possible cause for the rise in COVID cases is the staycation industry. Well, we're not sure that that's where outbreaks are occurring. We know direct provision centres, meat plants and so on are responsible for a huge proportion.
The data internationally doesn't show travel up because the places like the Canary Islands, the Balearics, have low levels of infection. For instance, if you were to go to Spain, it's the suburbs of Barcelona, the suburbs of Madrid with the high infection. Germany, very similar to us. Meat plants at the heart of the action again. Factories, minds. It tends not to follow travel, but health people don't like movement because once you've got a potential infection arriving in a clean area, they all get a bit jumpy about that. Malta is a good example here. They had a very, very clean record all through, and they opened the borders. And things were moving along very nicely, but 100 cases arrived in one day on a migrant boat from Africa. And even though they were identified and isolated on the ship, the figures for Malta are now some of the lowest in Europe. So they were off, for instance, Ireland's Greenlist. Travel doesn't tend to be where the infections come from, but health people don't like travel because they've less control over it than they have over localised factors.
A brief question from John and Tala. Still waiting for a refund from Ryanair since March. I'm getting no response. Any advice?
The Ryanair are telling me that the March and April refunds have nearly all been paid. That is clearly not the case because I'm hearing not just John from Tala's evidence here. One of the things that is worth having a look at is, are you booked through an intermediary? Are you booked through some of them not based in Ireland, Love Holiday, eDreams, people like that? If they are, if that is the case, Ryanair do not have your email address. So go back to them to make with the booking reference and tell them exactly what's going on. This is my booking reference, this is my email address, and I haven't been paid since March. They have been working through that huge backlog of nearly 30 million bookings that they have to refund. But what Ryanair say is, in a lot of the cases, they don't actually have the correct email addresses because some of the intermediaries book with
others like that should check it out. Owen, we leave it there. Eoghan Corry, editor of Air and Travel magazine. Thank you very much.
Always a pleasure, Pat. Thank you.